Welcome to another session of African American Religious Experience, Theology 333. My name is Dr. Gregory Jones, and I'll be sharing with you in this session a couple of things that I think are important. One of the things that we will do this session, this lecture session, is we will do some vocabulary. We will do some explanation of some of the basic vocabulary of Black theology, Black church. And some of the work will come out of Afrocentric Christianity by J. Deotis Roberts. We will be using that work, as well as we will be looking at some of the formal terminology for Black theology. Please look at this as a way of understanding and being prepared for our first unit test, which will deal with some of the vocabulary that we see being utilized in this work. Some terms for the first test. One of the first terms that I want to share with you today is nomo. Nomo is word force, and you might not understand nomo. Nomo is an African concept. It's given to us by a gentleman out of Temple University called Molefe Asante, and he talks about Afrocentrism. And one of the things that he suggests is that we look at some of the cultural norms within the African culture and begin to understand how these play an important part in the development of a worldview or conceptualization that Africans bring with them to America. One of the first things that I want to make note of in a very serious way is the orality of African people. We are a people that utilize oral tradition in our storytelling, in our mythology, in our cosmological construct, and how we form and communicate relationships, not only in our intimate nuclear family structures, but throughout our relationships in community. Nomo is a word that means word force, and we want to talk about how we utilize in this oral tradition the force of words in order to convey meaning, to show people our emphasis in terms of our particular ideas and understanding. This is an abstract concept, and I want to give you an analogy that is a story that might help you understand how nomo is so important to the African and African American community. When I was little, my mother used to take me for walks, and very frequently we would have to cross streets that were large. If you lived in Chicago, for example, you would know that 55th Street was a large street that had to be crossed if you were walking through the city on the south side. And so one day my mother was walking with me toward 55th Street, and I broke loose from her. And I began to run very rapidly toward the very busy, trafficked street. My mother took a deep breath, and with as much articulation and strength of spirit and volume, she said, "Stop!" And the force of her word literally drew me to a halt. And then she said to me again, "Come back here." Again, the force of her word, the orality, the strength of her word literally captured me and turned me around and brought me back to safety. This is an effective use of nomo. It's a very laden but very real part of how Africans and African Americans articulate and deal with one another with communication. And we see this later on when we start talking about the Black church and we start talking about the tremendous oral tradition of Black preaching and homiletic. We will see nomo, word force, being utilized in various ways to articulate and amplify storytelling and amplify the biblical tradition through the homiletic of the Black preacher. Nomo means word force. I want to look at some more vocabulary in relationship to that. We want to talk about Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism is a word that Molefe Asante created to talk about, and it means Africa at the center. when we say something is Afrocentric, what we're saying is that Africa no longer is just the sidebar kind of notion, but it is at the center of our thinking, of our ideology, and our understanding of worldview. Just like Eurocentric has influenced much of the thinking in the global community as we look at the historical kinds of impacts that Europeans have attempted to have in the global community, we need to, Molife Asante is saying, be Afrocentric, that we need to focus our attention, our understanding, and make Africa not the object but the subject. We want to be able to understand with clarity the purpose that Africa plays in the influence and contribution of universal community. Afrocentrism is a very, very important vocabulary word in the African American religious experience. Giving you two, Nomo and then Afrocentrism. I also want you to be very clear about who Molife Asante is. Molife Asante is a excellent scholar coming out of Temple University, providing for us this very special and very important perspective of Afrocentric education and Afrocentric ideology, and we begin to look at him as well as Sheikha Anta Diop, who is an archaeologist and anthropologist, and in contributing to us an understanding of how to utilize the contributions of Africa and African people in the understanding of the development of the African American religious experience. Moving on, we want to also look at some terminology that comes up around the 1960s, starting with a gentleman by the name of James Cone. I want to show you a work that he has, God of the Oppressed. God of the Oppressed by James H. Cone is one of the seminal works that have been written. He also wrote Black Theology, an introduction. James Cone is seen as the father of Black theology. And what I'm going to do is give you several terms that he utilizes and begins to evolve out of his understanding of Black theology in the Black church. One of the things that he says, he talks about is Black Christology. Black Christology. This is another term. The section of Christian theology that deals with the identity of Christ, particularly with his human and divine nature as it's reflected in and toward African American people. When we talk about Jesus, when we talk about the Christ, and we talk about the anointed one with the anointed, we often do not recognize that this is a concept, a Christological concept, that Africans and African American people firmly place within the context and culture of Africa. So when we talk about lamb's hair and hair like lamb's wool and skin like burnt bronze, what we're talking about is a worldview, an Afrocentric worldview that visits the notion that Christ indeed is of African descent. A Christological notion simply suggests that the movement and agency of Jesus Christ is firmly seated within the aspiration of African American people. Black hermeneutics. Black hermeneutics is the interpretation and exegesis of the text, the biblical text, as it relates to the experience and reality of African American religious experience. When we do black hermeneutics, what we do is we exegete the text and we look for those stories, those moments in the text that firmly rest within the aspiration and context of African and African American people. So, for example, when we talk about David and Goliath, or if we talk about the nation of Israel coming out of Egypt, and other stories that we look at in the Old and New Testament, we begin to recognize those stories from a firm understanding of an African and Afrocentric aspiration or understanding or tradition. We're looking at African people as they are impacted by the biblical text, the textual text, and how they are included, the presence of Africans and African Americans in the text, in the perception of the hermeneutic and study of the textual tradition. When we talk about black eschatology, we talk about the study of end times. That eschaton means end times, and we're talking about the end times as it relates to the biblical resurrection, hell, eternal life, and the prophetic end results of African Americans' quest for justice and redemption out of the experience that they find themselves in American culture and American society. The divine intervention toward a just world, if you will. And I want you to understand, when we talk about Africans and the African American religious experience, I want you to be clear about the whole process of the eschatological process. For example, some older African Americans said when Barack Obama became president of the United States, that was an eschatological or end time result of a lifetime of struggle for justice and equality. Depending on when you were born and where you were born, a black president was something that was seen to be at the end of the quest for justice and equality. We all know that just because you have a black president, it doesn't necessarily change the conditions of the masses of African American people. But we must be respectful of the fact that there are many people in the African American community, older people, who experienced voters registration struggles, the fact that blacks were hung and lynched before they were allowed to vote, the whole struggle for humanity, the whole struggle for equal rights. Well, an African American president indicates that is an eschatological striving that we have attained, end time striving that we have attained, that we are able to seat an African American president. But certainly for those of us who are still involved in the struggle for African Americans in this country and around the world, we know that is not necessarily the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to deal with the continued resistance and survival and ultimately liberation from institutional racism that still raises its head in many aspects of cultural life here in the West, in Western European culture and society. We still have work to do. But that is an eschaton or eschatological goal. That ultimately what we want to be is we want to be a community that is treated with respect, with dignity, with a sense of fair play and equity, and that's something that we continue, and racism and racist ideology and perspective is something we continue to resist, seek to survive, and ultimately to be liberated from. I want to move on now. We talked about black hermeneutic. Let me give you a very basic understanding of the whole tradition of black theology. We want to get a basic definition for that. Black theology is a movement in North American theology which became significant in the 1960s under the leadership of James Cone, who emphasized the distinct nature of the African American religious experience as a valid and important part of the religious journey of the Africans in diaspora who found themselves in America. And let me deal with that word while we've heard it several times in several sessions. When we talk about the African diaspora, what we're talking about, another vocabulary word here, we're talking about the dispersal of Africans over the global community as we look at slavery and the impact of slavery. And we'll talk about, as I had promised you, we will spend just a brief time talking about the triangle trade. We're going to give you some definition of that as well, and hopefully give you a fuller explanation in our next session. But the diaspora is the dispersal of Africans over the global community. Okay, another word that I would like to give you, and it's kind of it's a word that Peter Parrish, Dr. Peter Parrish uses when he talks about the spirituality of African peoples. He talks about something called tabula rasa. Tabula rasa means clean slate. That is to say, when Europeans attempted to negate the contributions and influences of Africans in the world and global community, they made the assumption, and they created the assumption, that the Africans that they found had nothing on their brain of worth, of value, in terms of contribution. It was a clean slate. And that's where we get some terminology we hear in the old understanding of Africans in America, that Africa is a dark continent. They were just savages that were running around. There was nothing going on that was of value that contributed to the development and the intellectual currency of the world. And still today, we see Europeans, Eurocentric notion that the global community, in effect, the third world, or what they would term the third world community, or Africa, or South America, or even, and to some extent, the Asian Peninsula, doesn't have valuable intellectual currency to give contribution to Western culture and Western civilization. This is totally erroneous. What Peter Paris says with this notion of tabula rasa, this whole notion of clean slate, is it gives Europeans an opportunity to say, we were the only ones that brought forth any kind of worthy contribution to the development of the African American experience in Western society. And this is completely wrong, but you need this vocabulary, you need to understand this vocabulary to recognize the tremendous contributions that Africans do purpose and give to the development of global community. And that is the reason why I'm sharing this vocabulary with you, so that you would understand what Molife Asante is saying. With the Afrocentric perspective, we begin to understand and develop and appreciate the tremendous contributions that Africans and African Americans are rendering to intellectual currency, not only in the past, but continual to the present and the future. And we will get to that when we start looking at the tremendous contributions that Africans in America continue to make and historically have made into the development of the United States and Western culture and Western society. I want to begin toward the end of this lecture, just a brief understanding of what we would term the triangle trade. The triangle trade is basically the trade that went from England and Europe to Africa, to the western coasts of Africa, through the Middle Passage, and then to the Caribbean, and then to the Americas, and back to England and Europe. Essentially, when we talk about the triangle trade, we're talking about the Atlantic trade. What we're looking at in the Atlantic trade is the development of a population of Africans that are basically brought from Africa through the Middle Passage to the Caribbeans, seeding the Caribbeans and providing basically a stockbrokering kind of tradition in terms of the selling of slaves to the Americas, both North and South and Mesoamerica, and then the proceeds taken back to Europe, purchasing again chains and guns and armaments and various trinkets, going back from coming from England to Africa, exchanging the guns and gunpowder technology, utilizing the chains for slave and slave labor populations, bringing them across the Middle Passage that took about 90 to 120 days into the Caribbean, setting up factories, what we call slave factories for the slaves, the newly purchased slaves, and preparing them so that they can be slave labor capital for the Americas, for the land that has been developed and purchased in the Americas. So when we talk about the triangle trade, we talk about a significant system of capturing and incarcerating and developing slave populations. We will go into depth in terms of this on next time in our next section, when we will focus in on the triangle trade and the Africans' arrival into the Americas. Have a great day. We will see each other next session.